After the Battle of Citra in 203 BC, the Punic forces in North Africa were scattered, and their crucial ally Syphax suffered a decisive defeat. Although the Punic fleet achieved minor success, it was not enough to pose a serious threat to the advancing Roman army. The Roman expeditionary force, led by Scipio, continued to grow as more Numidians joined the cause of Massinissa. By the end of the 203 BC campaign season, the Punic Senate faced internal divisions, with some urging a continuation of the struggle while others advocated for peace. Eventually, the voices calling for peace prevailed, and the 30 most senior members, known as the Gerousia, were sent to negotiate with Scipio for an end to the war. The Carthaginians reluctantly accepted the terms, although according to Livy, some believed they were merely buying time, hoping that the return of Hannibal's army could reverse the military situation. Despite the armistice being in place throughout the winter months, the arrival of Hannibal and his forces in Africa changed the mood in Carthage. The return of Hannibal and his experienced soldiers rekindled the desire for war among all classes in Carthage. There was now overwhelming support for resuming hostility, with the hope of achieving a victory that would lead to more favorable terms. When the Roman delegation arrived in Carthage, they were surrounded by an angry mob, and their safety was ensured only through the intervention of the city's magistrates. The resumption of campaigning saw a more determined and ruthless Scipio, aiming to decisively end the war. Cities that surrendered voluntarily were no longer granted lenient terms. Instead, their populations were enslaved as if the cities had been taken by force. The Roman campaign in Africa became increasingly brutal, prompting Carthaginian authorities to press Hannibal to engage in battle. However, Hannibal, stationed near Hadrumetum, remained patient and refused to be rushed. Recognizing the weakness of his army and cavalry, Hannibal successfully persuaded Tychius, a relative of Syphax, to join him with 2,000 Numidian light horse. Simultaneously, Scipio urged Massinissa, his Numidian ally, to fulfill his support by bringing a substantial force of auxiliaries to aid the Roman army. Hannibal, in an effort to break the stalemate, eventually decided to take action and moved his forces to Zama, a location 5 days' march west of Carthage. As the Carthaginians advanced, Massinissa arrived at the Roman camp with reinforcements, providing 4,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry, the latter possibly including troops from Laelius' command. According to Appian, the Carthaginian army at the Battle of Zama was reported to have 50,000 men, but many modern historians dispute this claim. Most scholars, relying on Polybius, estimate the Carthaginian forces at 40,000, with only 4,000 being cavalry. The majority of the army consisted of infantry. In Italy, Hannibal's army had left behind its horses due to limited shipping space, and the defeat of Syphax by Massinissa had cut off the supply of Numidian cavalry. Despite the recent addition of 2,000 Numidians, the Carthaginians had only 4,000 cavalry. Hannibal, recognizing the strategic importance of cavalry, especially in the absence of a significant Numidian force, deployed 80 war elephants at Zama. This battle marked the first recorded use of war elephants since Scipio's invasion. Hannibal deliberately delayed engaging in battle to allow his army time to train and prepare this force of elephant. The exact number of men under Scipio's command at the Battle of Zama is not well documented. An estimated 25,000 to 30,000 soldiers had landed in Africa in 205 BC, and there is no record of additional reinforcements arriving from Italy. The strength of the force left to guard the camp and maintain the siege of Utica is unclear, as is the extent of attrition suffered in the various battles and skirmishes the legions had participated in thus far. Historical sources unanimously state that the Romans were supported by 6,000 Numidian infantry and 4,000 cavalry led by Massinissa. Appian, writing 350 years after the event, claims that the Numidians brought the total Roman force to 34,500 troops, but modern historians generally reject this figure. Instead, they typically cite a total of 29,000 or 30,000, with Nigel Bagnall suggesting 40,000. Among these, slightly over 6,000 were cavalry. According to Goldsworthy, it is likely that the Romans had fewer infantry but a notably higher cavalry count compared to their Carthaginian opponents. With a battle now inevitable, the following morning saw both commanders, Hannibal and Scipio, organizing their troops and addressing them. According to Polybius, both armies were led by highly skilled and well-trained generals, with the Carthaginians fighting for their lives and homeland, and the Romans striving for the supremacy of their empire. The outcome of the battle would not only determine the fate of Africa or Europe, but also decide who would emerge as the masters of all other parts of the world known to history. Despite the Roman advantage in cavalry, the overall numbers on both sides were likely comparable. Hannibal arranged his army into 3 lines positioned behind his 80 elephants, which likely spanned his entire front. Directly behind the elephants were approximately 12,000 troops, including Ligurians, Gauls, and Balearic slingers from Mago's previous army. The second line consisted of forces raised for the defense of Africa, including Libyans and a significant contingent of Punic citizens appearing as a formed unit, a rare occurrence during the wars. Some traditions mentioned a strong presence of Macedonians in this line, but since it would be unusual for Polybius to omit the involvement of Hellenic troops, this is typically dismissed. The last line, positioned a couple of 100 yards behind the second, consisted of Hannibal's own veterans, a diverse mix of soldiers from various races, most now equipped with Roman armor and shields. Finally, the cavalry were stationed on the wings, with the Numidians on the left and the Carthaginians on the right, both groups covered by the elephant. Scipio organized his army in the traditional 3 lines, with the Hastati in the front rank, followed by the Principes and the Triarii at the rear. The cavalry was positioned on the wings, with Laelius leading the Romans on the left and Massinissa leading his Numidians on the right. However, there was a departure from the usual formation in Scipio's detailed dispositions. Instead of arranging the maniples in the standard checkerboard fashion, the men in the second line were placed directly behind those in the first, creating lanes between them to accommodate the advancing Carthaginian elephants. The specific distances between the 3 lines are not specified, but it is reasonable to assume that enough space was left for the maniples to maneuver within the legions in the customary manner. Scipio's strategic innovation involved the Velites, serving as skirmishers, who were instructed to withdraw down the lanes between the maniples when confronted by the Carthaginian elephant. Following this withdrawal, the Velites were directed to either fall back to the rear or turn to the right and left between the formation, allowing them to harass the elephants as they passed. The deployment of both sides exhibited striking similarities, underscoring the extent to which the 2 military systems had learned from each other during the extended years of war.
Another day dawns, and another battle beckons. Well, men, this is nothing new to us. One day, when all our enemies are crushed, we will go home with honor. Until then, prepare for battle.
Make ready, men! Make ready! For today, we crush our enemies! We will drive them before us! And when our bloody work is done, we shall hear their lamentation and the cries of carrion birds, and it will be glorious!
The process of the 2 armies marching out and deploying took several hours, marked by occasional skirmishes between the Numidian horsemen serving on both sides. Finally, when both forces were fully prepared, and the commanders had concluded their speeches, each side raised a cheer and sounded trumpets in the traditional Deploypent to convey confidence and intimidate the opposing forces. Finally, Hannibal commanded the elephants to charge. In response, the Romans sounded their bugles and possibly followed their customary practice of beating on their shields with their sword. The result was precisely what Scipio had hoped for. On the left, some of the elephants panicked and stampeded back through their own cavalry ranks. Capitalizing on this opportunity, Massinissa led his men in an immediate attack on Hannibal's Numidian allies, swiftly routing them. The remaining elephants surged forward against the Roman infantry, presenting an undoubtedly intimidating spectacle as the massive animals advanced toward the awaiting Romans. The Velites, serving as skirmishers, moved forward and hurled javelins at the approaching elephant. Wounded or with their crews killed, the elephants became even more prone to panic. Some Velites fell, and others retreated behind the organized maniples of Hastati, but few elephants charged directly into the heavy infantry. Instead, most stampeded through the intentionally created lanes in the Roman formation, later being dealt with at leisure in the rear of the army. Some elephants on the right veered towards the Roman cavalry, but changed direction upon encountering a volley of javelins. Now completely uncontrollable, they burst back through the Carthaginian cavalry. Following Massinissa's example, Laelius charged forward against the disordered enemy horse, putting them to flight. The elephant attack failed, and Hannibal lost both of his cavalry wings in the early stages of the battle. However, both Laelius and Massinissa chased the enemy cavalry off the battlefield, preventing any attempts at rallying. This meant that the Roman cavalry would be unable to intervene in the main action for a significant amount of time. Some have suggested that Hannibal intentionally ordered his cavalry to flee to draw the numerically superior enemy horse away from the action, but this notion is likely incorrect. The Punic cavalry would have been more valuable to Hannibal if they had remained to engage Scipio's cavalry for as long as possible. The rapid flight of Hannibal's cavalry resulted not so much from the numerical superiority of the Romans and Numidians, but from the confusion caused by the stampeding elephants. The initial advance of the first two lines of Punic infantry likely began simultaneously with the elephant attack. However, the third line, following Hannibal's direct orders, remained stationary. The war cries of the Romans, along with the clashing of their shields, resonated against the peculiar shouts of the various Carthaginian contingents, creating a cacophony that was eventually drowned out by the overall noise of battle. Initially, neither side gained a clear advantage as the ranks thinned and the casualties mounted. In the thick of the fighting, men tumbled over one another, succumbing to spear or sword thrusts, and forming gruesome obstacles. Mago's seasoned army attacked with great enthusiasm, inflicting significant losses on the Hastati. After each temporary pause in the fighting, they resumed combat, but gradually their assaults weakened, while the Romans steadily pushed forward. The Ligurians, Gauls, and other soldiers in the Punic first line received limited assistance from their supports, with the second line of Libyans and Carthaginians holding back. This lack of cooperation between the two lines is likely another indication of the disunity among the disparate elements of Hannibal's army. It's possible that Hannibal had instructed the reserve lines not to allow fugitives through their ranks, similar to his directives to the veteran troops. As the Punic first line disintegrated, the Carthaginians and Libyans received orders to charge the Hastati, causing them to fall back in disarray. The Principes from the Roman second line came to their aid, reinforcing and rallying the Hastati after a period of chaos. Following another brutal phase of fighting, the Carthaginians broke and fled, with the Hastati, now lacking order after two intense battles, surging forward in pursuit. They mercilessly cut down the fleeing enemy. This phase was especially perilous, as it was when the majority of casualties occurred, making it particularly challenging for those wounded in the legs to escape. Hannibal's veterans, however, remained steadfast and refused to break their ranks. Instead, they presented a formidable row of leveled spear points to their comrades who were fleeing toward them. Officers shouted commands, urging the men to circumvent the flanks of the third line and regroup behind it. At least some units may have managed to recover and form up, contributing to the reinforcement of the last reserve of the Punic army. With the ground between the two armies now slippery with blood, cluttered with piles of wounded and dead, and strewn with discarded weapons, making any further organized conduct or fighting nearly impossible, Scipio signaled for the recall. He then directed the withdrawal of the wounded to the rear, and reorganized his army. The Principes and Triarii skillfully navigated through the corpse, and after closing ranks, they were aligned with the surviving Hastati on either flank. Hannibal likely had been repositioning the survivors of his two front lines of infantry. The surviving heavy infantry on both sides were roughly equal in numbers. Most of the original Carthaginian soldiers were equipped similarly to the Romans they faced. These Carthaginian soldiers were seasoned veterans with many years of experience, and were still fresh, having not yet engaged in combat. Many of the Romans were also veterans, with some having fought at Cannae, and nearly all had participated in the 2, or for some, 3 major victories of the previous year. While some of the Romans were fatigued from the 2 intense battles just prior, their victories in both would have significantly boosted their morale. After completing their redeployments, the 2 opposing forces, in the words of Polybius, charged each other with the greatest fire and fury. With nearly equal numbers, spirit, courage, and weaponry, the battle remained undecided for a long time, with soldiers displaying obstinate valor and falling dead without yielding ground. At this critical juncture, Massinissa and Laelius, having returned from pursuing the Carthaginian cavalry, launched an attack on the rear of Hannibal's veteran army. Facing this unexpected assault, most of Hannibal's men fought to the end in hopeless confusion, resulting in disproportionately high casualties for the vanquished, similar to the situations at Cannae and Trasimene. A few attempted to escape across the open plain but became easy prey for the Roman and Numidian cavalry. Hannibal himself managed to escape with a small group of horsemen to Hadrameta, eventually making his way to Carthage. His arrival marked the end of a 36-year absence from the city. According to Polybius, 20,000 Carthaginians were killed, and an equal number were taken as prisoners, soldiers, accounting for the entire Carthaginian army. Roman losses, as reported by Polybius, amounted to 1,500 killed. This represented more than 5% of their total force. Goldsworthy remarks that this fatality rate is a substantial loss for a victorious army, indicating the intensity of the fighting. He characterizes the battle as a whole as a slogging match. The exact number of wounded is unknown, but ancient sources mention many Roman wounded being carried to the rear during the pause before the final engagement. At least 11 Carthaginian elephants survived the battle, and were subsequently captured by the Romans. The war, which had wrought devastation across the entire Mediterranean over the previous 17 years, had finally concluded. While Rome had paid a significant price in terms of human lives and material destruction, the victory established Rome as an imperial power of unparalleled military might.